I want to show you guys three positions and ask you the same question on all three of them. Here's position number one, and the question is, should we defend this pawn on b2? Here's position number two, very similar, but you can see some of the pieces are a little bit different. And the question again is, should we defend this pawn on b2? And here's position number three. You can see this one is quite different, but the question is, should we defend this pawn on a2? I want to do a shout out to Jason who asked this question, but his question was, how do you know when a pawn is worth defending? That's actually a fantastic question because this is a situation that comes up a lot in chess, right? There are lots of pawns on the board, lots of times they're undefended and they get attacked. It might be a situation like this, or like this, or like this, or any other situation, and you need to know, should I defend it? Should I be taking the time to defend that pawn, or should I be doing something else? In this video, I'm going to give you 8 different things that you want to think about. And if you follow all these 8 kind of principles and rules, it should give you a really good idea in your games of when to defend those pawns and when not to. So what I'm going to do is go through the 8 principles, and then after we go through all of those and you kind of understand those, we're going to come back to these 1, 2, and 3 positions, and we'll see if we can use those principles to help us answer the question in these positions of should we defend these pawns or not. All right, so the number 1 principle about defending pawns is that if you're playing an aggressive gambit, a lot of times you don't need to worry about those pawns too much as long as it fits with your overall plan for the game. So the Danish gambit is kind of one of my good examples for this, where you really don't care too much about your pawns, and in fact you just give them away. Even though you could take them, you're not even you don't even have to defend them, they're already defended. You don't even take them back, right? You just allow the opponent to take, you keep developing, you allow the opponent to take, and you give up the pawns intentionally because we gain quick development, we gain open files that we can use to attack, and we gain open diagonals. Okay, it's an intentional decision. Hey, I'm going to play aggressive. I'm not going to worry about the fact that I'm down some pawns. I'm going to focus on developing and attacking my opponent as quickly as possible. If that's the opening you're playing, this is just one example. King's Gambit is another example where if somebody starts attacking a random pawn, maybe over here, and later on I'm in the game and I'm attacking over here, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go forward with my plan. I'm going to keep attacking. I'm going to look for tactics. I'm going to be aggressive. Those types of positions in games, a lot of times it's a good idea to give up the pawn, right? Because it fits with your overall style for how you want to play the game. All right, let's move on to the second thing that you want to think about, and this is a positional type of pawn sacrifice. Now, all the ones that I was previously talking about, the Danish gambit, the King's gambit, those really aggressive gambits, they have to do with tempo and quick development and being aggressive. And the fact that you get 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 extra developing moves is really huge and is really beneficial in those types of positions. But there are also gambits where you give up pawns for a positional long-term advantage. Okay, and the Benko gambit is a perfect example of this. So it's c5, d5, and now we play the move b5. And the point here is not that we're going for quick development and trying to checkmate the king. It's not that we are, going to be harassing the queen and getting a bunch of free developing moves or anything like that. It's simply the fact that we want to play a6. We want to capture with this bishop, and we want to have long-term compensation along these files. And if we're able to trade off this bishop, that's kind of a good thing for us because it weakens some of these light squares. And a lot of times after, like eventually, usually white plays e4, the d3 square becomes very weak. We're able to push this pawn, and a lot of times we can hop one of our knights in there. So it's very long-term. Hey, we're just going to be playing the game down a pawn, but we're okay with it because of these things that I mentioned. Okay, so very different from the King's Gambit or the Danish Gambit, where it's all about get the pieces out as quickly as you can, go for the king, sacrifice, attack. Who cares about pawns, right? It's a different reason that we give up a pawn. And guys, I know that I haven't really mentioned the original question of when do we defend pawns, but I just wanted to make sure we understand some of the reasons in these openings, in the opening phase of the game, that we do give up our pawns, because that's going to be useful as we move through the rest of, the principles. Okay, so keep those two in the back of your mind: long-term positional sacrifices like the Benko Gambit, and then shorter-term, King's Gambit, Danish Gambit, pawn sacrifices, where we just want to get quick development and be aggressive and go for the king. All right, let's move on to number 3. All right, so the next thing that you want to be asking yourself when you're thinking about defending pawns is, how many tempo am I going to get if I give up this pawn? Okay, there's a general rule in chess that, generally speaking, 3 tempo is equal to a pawn. So what does that mean? A tempo is like one move that one side of the board plays. So one move for white, like knight f3, is a tempo, or e4 is one tempo for white. And if black plays, that would be a tempo for black. So if I can get 3 tempos, so like 1, 2, 3, in exchange for a pawn, that's usually pretty equal, okay? So let me give you an example of this. E4, D5, this is the Scandinavian, and there's this one line, sometimes people play Queen E5 check, and I usually like to just block with the bishop. Now, this is not a good move, but if black were to have played Queen G5 now and attack my pawn on G2, I could defend it. I could play a move like Bishop F3 to defend it, or Bishop F1 doesn't really make a lot of sense. So probably Bishop F3 would be the move that I would consider, or I can give it up. And here's a situation where I'm going to ask myself, okay, if I do give it up, how many tempo am I going to get in exchange for that pawn? Well, 1, I'm going to be able to move my knight and attack the queen, right? And of course, black's probably going to take. Now I can save my rook by playing rook to G1. Notice how everything is defended. This is kind of important when you're considering these things, because if any of my other pieces would be hanging, then this wouldn't work. But since everything's defended, I'm getting 2 moves in. Queen goes here. And notice how if I want, I can even play rook G3, kick it away some more, or knight G5 at some point in the future might be another tempo for me. So I've already gotten 1, 2, and it looks like I'm going to probably be able to get 3. I have the open file. I have lots of development. And so in this case, I'm going to say, yes, that makes sense to me to give up that pawn and not defend it, right? It makes sense to just keep developing and go down this route. Like I said, the simple way is just count how many tempo you're getting. 1, 2, and if I want, like I said, I can go rook G3. I got 3 moves for that pawn. Probably a good trade. Now, before we move on from this position, I want to just talk about the move D4 for a second, because D4 is kind of a different way to not defend the pawn instead of knight F3. And we're gaining the attack on the queen, and black can take here. But now you notice the position is actually quite different, because we have a little bit of a problem here that our rook is being attacked. Now, we could save that and play bishop to F3, but then the queen goes back. And we did get 1, 2 moves. The difference here, and this is really important, is look at our development. Our development is not as much as previously. We had all our pieces out. We had our knight, our rook involved, right? Why is that the case? Well, because one of these tempo moves that we got for free was a bishop that had already been moved, right? So we played D4 and we played bishop F3, sorry, as opposed to, if I go back here, knight to F3 and rook to G1. So notice how these moves are much more effective moves, I would say, than like moving the bishop a second time. And this is a subtle difference, but these are the things that you want to consider when you're thinking about not defending a pawn. The tempo moves that I get, are they actually beneficial tempo moves, or is it like, well, yeah, I can move this one bishop around 3 times attacking the queen, but that's all I really get out of it? That's not the same as getting 2 brand new pieces that weren't in the game previously into the game. Okay, so just think through that. It can be a little tricky depending on the situation, but I think you guys get the idea. All right, guys, the next thing you want to be thinking about is a lot of times it's a queen that's attacking the pawn that's undefended, and a lot of the times a queen can get trapped. So here's a very basic example. Sometimes it's more complicated than this, so keep that in mind, but here's a very basic example where we play H3, black says, oh, a free pawn, and what do we play? Rook F to B1, right? We're attacking the queen, and because the rook's involved here, there's nowhere for the queen to go. Everything's defended, and black just lost their queen, okay? So keep that in mind. It's like I said, this is a very basic example, but this shows up in all different ways. It's not always with the rook. Sometimes your knight's trapping, sometimes the bishop's trapping. Like, lots of different ways this can happen. But if you can set a queen trap, that's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind, okay? Because a lot of times that can be very tricky, especially at the lower levels. People like to just take pawns, and they don't necessarily think that their queen's going to get trapped because the queen is such a powerful piece, but it really does happen more often than you think. All right, guys, and the next thing that I want to mention is sometimes you have these situations where there's a bishop attacking a pawn like this, one of these A or H pawns, and if the bishop takes it, a lot of the times you can simply play B3, or if it's on this side of the board, G3, trap the bishop from going back, and then you just attack it with whatever pieces you have around. In this case, it's going to be the king. Sometimes it's a rook, sometimes it's another piece. And black has no way to save their bishop, right? They just can't really do anything. So for example, they like try to push this pawn to get forward. It's not in time to create an opening, and we simply are going to win the bishop, okay? Now, you may have noticed that there's this move knight to E4, which is a good move for black, but we actually still have a nice idea here. If you want to pause and think through what's the move we play here. If you had a chance to do that, the move is simply king to B2. We just ignore the rook, because at the end of the day, we're going to be getting a knight and a bishop, which if you remember, a rook and a knight and a bishop is better than a rook and a pawn, right? And so yes, black can take that, but we're going to just take here. And yes, in this case, black even gets an extra pawn. This is still better for us. The knight and bishop are better than a rook and 2 pawns most of the time. So still a good trade. But the point is, just remember, when the bishop takes, a lot of times you can just trap it with your pawns. Okay, so usually those turn out to be poisoned pawns when bishops take them like that. So keep that in mind. All right, the next thing that you want to be asking yourself is, which pawn is it that's potentially being attacked? And if I lose that pawn, how is it going to affect my king or weaknesses around my king? So, for example, this position right here, if we lose this pawn, is it going to affect our king or put our king in any kind of danger or hinder what we're trying to do on the king side over here at all? Not really. I mean, yes, we lose a pawn, and yes, I don't know if it's worth it, but it's not going to put our king in danger right now. And it's not going to, if we're trying to attack over here on the king side, it's not going to affect us. Let's look at this position. If we lose this pawn on g2, is it going to affect our king? Yeah, absolutely, right? We have to move our rook. We don't really have a great move. We probably have to go rook f1. We might actually lose 2 pawns. Our king is now kind of exposed. We're going to have to try to get castled as quickly as we can before we get into trouble. Very different situation than going back here where it's like, meh, I don't really care that much about that pawn. Like, yes, you have to be careful, but you can see the difference, right? This is a position where I'm absolutely going to defend that pawn. I'm probably going to play queen f3 or maybe rook g1. I don't know, but I'm not going to let black take that, right? This position, I might give that up and just say, you know what? I'm going to keep attacking over here on the king side. I'm not worried about that. Keep that in mind, okay? Which pawn are we talking about? That's important. All right, the next thing I want to mention is the piece that's taking the pawn that you're thinking about defending. In this case, in this example, it's the queen taking this pawn. Is that piece going to be out of position if they take the pawn? So in this case, let's say I played a move like knight to e5, and my plan was getting ready to set up my queen to come over here, maybe trade this, bring the queen, get an attack going on the king. Is black's queen going to be out of position if they take this? The answer is yeah, it kind of is. Like, it's not going to be able to come back to c7 or d8 to help defend over here. It's kind of blocked off really from getting back to this side of the board, right? And so I would say yes, it's absolutely out of position. And you know, we can even play a move like knight h5. I'm looking at Stockfish here to help me, but building the pressure over here, and after this takes check. I mean, look at this. This is kind of nasty. Notice black's queen is way far from the action. Okay, if it was on d8 or c7, it could potentially be involved in the game pretty quickly. Right now, it can't. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. If we go compare it to this position, if the queen takes here, is black's queen out of position as far as what's happening in the game? Not really. It's not like there's an attack on the queen side where all the queen has to be over there. No, like, it's in a pretty good position. I think on g2, it's by the king. It's attacking this other stuff, right? That's important. Again, that's something you need to think about. Is it going to misplace the piece? If so, probably you can get away giving away that pawn. If not, don't do it. All right, guys, so the last thing that I want to kind of mention is when you're thinking about should I defend a pawn or not, you want to be asking yourself the question, do I have a better move? Like, do I just have something really good that I can do instead of defending the pawn? So in this position, if you'd like to pause and think through, does white have any really good moves that are better than defending this pawn? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the answer is yes, absolutely. Taking here on g6 is a really strong move because we're threatening now to take f7 with check. So if black did try to do something like this, we'd be able to throw in this move first and completely mess up black's king. So of course, they probably don't want to do that. They can take here, but then again, we can take on g6 with check. And it's because we've got this pin on the rook, right? And so I don't know what black's going to do. They can take. That's not very good for them. They can move. Also not very good. And so because we had this really good move, it made sense for us to ignore the pawn and not defend it. Because if we go back to the beginning here, if we say, oh, I better defend my pawn, let me play rook b1. Well, now black has time to do something over here. They can just play knight takes h5 and completely eliminate our threat, right? So you want to be thinking through, how good is the move that I would like to play instead of defending this pawn? How good is it, right? And if it's a strong move, you need to play that instead of defending your pawn. If you don't have a good move, well, then maybe it makes more sense to defend the pawn. All right, so those are the things that you want to be thinking through when it comes to should I defend a pawn or not. Now, having said all of those 8 things, I want to go back to the original 3 positions and kind of use them as examples to see if we can figure out what we should do. All right, so here we are back on position number 1. Should we defend this pawn or not? So, you want to kind of go through the list of all the things that I mentioned, a couple of them just as an example. I'm going to be looking like, do I have any really good other moves that I can play instead of defending the pawn? I don't really see too much happening, so I'm going to say no. The other thing, is this an aggressive gambit where I'm trying to get my pieces out as quickly as I can to attack the king? Not really. It's a d4 opening. There's not really much going on for the king. It's going to take me quite a while before I can get my knight and my bishop out and my queen out to generate any kind of attack, right? So I don't think that's really at play. Would this be a long-term positional sacrifice? Maybe, but just having a half-open b-file by itself, I don't know that that's quite good enough, so I don't really think so. If I think of it in terms of how many tempo can I get, maybe I can play a move like queen d2, captures. I'm going to get 1 tempo with my rook, maybe a 2nd tempo with my rook. Is that really useful for me? It's decent. It's decent, but in this case, I think, and Stockfish agrees with me, I think that I would play rook to b1 in this position, right? There's not much going on. If you go through that list of 8 things, there's not much else going on that would tell me to sacrifice the pawn, so I am going to defend it. All right, let's go ahead and jump to the next position. So same question, should we defend it? And this is actually a very tricky position. There's a really cool move that I wanted to show you. And the move is a3. And you might say, what in the world is that all about, right? It looks like you're allowing the queen and you still have the knight problem. Why would we play a3? Well, remember one of those items on the list that I mentioned, a queen trap, right? This is a good example of setting a very clever trap. Queen takes b2 and we have the amazing move knight to a4. And check this out. We're attacking the queen and this is covered, this is covered, this is covered, this is covered by the knight, this is covered by the queen, this is covered by the bishop. The queen is trapped, right? It's a really cool queen trap with a knight. So that's why I was mentioning earlier, it didn't always have to be with the rook. We can do it with the knight, right? So this is an example of, I think a3 is a cool move to play. Very tricky to see that. A lot of players are going to miss that. Now, of course, you didn't have to do that. You could play a move like queen d2 and go for this, but again, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's quite worth it. This is a little bit more of an aggressive position, so maybe that makes a little more sense, a move like queen d3 or queen d2, just to get the rook involved. It does look like we can generate an attack pretty quickly, like for example, after something like this, rook b1, bishop c4, I'm seeing that we have a lot of pieces out. Rook can come up to b3, maybe even swing over it later if black castles, and so this position, when I compare it to this, I'm much more likely to sacrifice the pawn here, right? We had a queen trap idea. Even if we didn't see that, we just went with sort of the basic queen d2 move. It looks like a position that's much more aggressive and promising than this one, okay? And I'm much more likely to give up my pawn in this position than this one. Hope that makes sense. All right, let's go to the third one. Should we give up the a pawn or should we defend it, right? We could play king b1 and defend it. If I think about which pawn it is, it's one that's close to my king. I'm going to think, okay, maybe I should defend that, right? But that's not the only thing that I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about, do I have other good moves, right? And if you look at this position carefully, you'll notice knight takes f6 check, captures, and queen takes d6. This is a very strong move. I'm threatening the bishop. So if my opponent does take this, guess what? I can take this bishop. Now you do have to do a little calculating here. What happens after check? And let's just say the rook comes over or queen takes b2. You have to think through that. But it turns out it's totally fine for white. It's actually good for us. On here, we can simply take the queen. And it's kind of this big queen trade, but we still end up with an extra piece, right? So that's fine. And then the other move that black could have played was like queen takes b2. We can actually just rook b1, attack the queen. We've got threats here. We can run our king over. It's a tricky position, but it's good for us. So with a little bit of calculating, you should have come to the conclusion that it was better to leave the pawn and go for the bigger threat in this position. Okay, so again, the answer to the question of should you defend a pawn is it depends, right? But hopefully, having watched this video, you have all these different ideas now in your head that you know what to think about. So when you get in your games and you find yourself wondering, should I defend that pawn or not? You'll know, what the answer is. And one more kind of bonus tip, I just thought about this. As you get more and more towards the end of the game, the pawns become more valuable, okay? And so if most of the pieces are traded off, there's only a couple of pieces on the board, you really probably want to be very careful before you start giving up those pawns at the later stages of the game. All right, guys, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.